In this presentation, we will graph cost lines with data in Excel. This will give us a better idea of the relationship of units, variable cost, fixed cost, total cost. As units go up, what will happen to variable cost, fixed costs, and total costs. It'll give us an idea of how to graph this information, as well as how to use Excel to graph the information and see how this looks pictorially, which is often how we visualize items, how we visualize numbers. So you can see here that we have our units. The units are increasing. So we have units increasing. We have variable costs, and they are increasing as well. They're going to be increasing with a constant rate as we increase the units. So in other words, a straight line relationship as we increase with the units. The fixed cost, something like the rent, notice it starts at 0 units. It's at 20,000. The rent is what it is, even if we do not produce anything. And it remains at 20,000 all the way down. So no change to the rent. And then the total costs, which is going to be the sum of the variable and fixed costs at 20,000, and then increasing from 20 by the variable costs. So the variable costs then increasing to the total cost. So now we want to take a look at this and think about, all right, well, what if we graphed this information? How could we graph it? What would the graph look like? First, let's graph them one at a time. Let's compare the units and the variable costs. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight these two columns. Those are the two columns we want to pick up. And we're going to go to the insert, and we're looking for the graphs and charts. So we're in charts areas here. We don't want this item. It's tempting to go here. We want this basically the scatter. So we want the scatter items here. We can use a line though. We don't really need the scatter. We want basically the line. So we're going to go to the line item. So we'll select that item, and there we have it. So now we've graphed this here. You can see on the vertical axis that we're starting at 0. We're going up to the 35, that being the cost. And then on the horizontal, we've got from 0 going up to 2,500, that being the units. So you'll note that the system, Excel, is picking which unit variables we want. We got 500 to 1,000. Here we have 200, 400. We could change these items by adjusting this graph. So it's being labeled variable costs. We could keep this, and we could do some minor adjustments. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the adjustments, but if we wanted to change, say, the axes and the valuation, that's going to be a common type of change we may need. One way to get there is to go to this plus item. We want to look at the axis. So we're looking at the axis. I'm going to select this item, and we'll go to more options. We have the primary horizontal and vertical axes. And so here's going to be the information. We have bounds. We have 0 to 2,500. That's going to be these bounds here. Now, if we want to stop it at 2,000, because that's the end of our data for the units, we could say 2,000 ending. And then the difference we want between these is 200. So it goes from 0 to 2, 4, 6. So I'm going to say I want the difference to be basically 200 here instead of 500. And see that change. And so now it goes 0, 2, 4, 6. Now I'm going to select the vertical axis. I'm just going to click on the vertical axis, and it'll change our data over here. Once again, we could set the top number to 30,000 if we so choose. And these are going to be in variables of 0 to 3 to 6. So we could say we want the variables, the difference to be 3,000 in the intervals that are going to be counted up. So that'll match exactly our data set if we wanted to set it up in that format. And then we would have our line. Now, this is what we would expect from the variable costs. So if we talk about like direct materials, we would expect if we make no materials, it would be 0. And then it would go up from there. As we have 200 units, we would then say that we have 3,000 variable costs. At 400, we have 6,000. At 600, we have the 9,000, and so on. We have a straight line relationship that goes 0 at the bottom. I'm going to pull this over, and let's say, okay, well, what would happen if we compare this to the fixed costs? So I want to just see these two sets of numbers first. So what I'm going to do is highlight the units and then the fixed costs. Let's do that again. Highlight the units. I'm holding down Control and then the fixed costs. I'm holding down Control to highlight two non-adjacent cells or columns that are not next to each other. And then we'll go to the insert, and we'll say same items. We want this one. I'm going to make it a line. And so there we have that one. And it's pretty boring. I'm not even going to really change it because we could, but we can change the same intervals here and whatnot. But notice what happens is as the units go up, the cost is 20,000. It stays the same. So that's going to be the typical graph we would expect there. We expect a straight line on the vertical. As we have an increase in units, we're going to say that there's no change to the cost. Something like the rent, for example, would be the same all the way across. And then let's do the same for the total costs. Say I highlight these and highlight the total cost. Insert, and we have our chart, and let's say we do this item for the total cost. Now it looks similar to what we had for the variable cost, but notice it starts, or it hits the Y at this 20,000. So it hits the Y at that 20,000. That's because that's where the fixed costs start. So that's what we would expect to see. If you wanted to change these again, you could go to these items and go to the axis, more options, and we can change. It went down to this axis. Let's do that again. We can go to these items. We go to the plus and axis, more options. And then we're going to say that the maximum we can put at 2,000 to match what we had in our other graph. And then we have the 200 in the interval. And let's keep it there. So we have the total cost. So now it starts here and it's going to increase. Now, next thing we could do is we could put what would happen if we had all these on one graph. Could we do that just to practice this? I'm going to pull this over again. We could say, hey, how about we just highlight the whole thing? And we do the whole thing here. And we go to insert and we go to the charts and use the scatter chart and do the same thing for the entire graph. So we could do the whole thing, costs, and we have the similar kind of graph that we saw here. If we double click these items to get to it, to this option, we're going to say the intervals. Once again, I'm just going to say the 200 on the intervals, and we'll keep that. And so now if you look at this graph, this is the type of graph that you see with all of them on there. And a common type of test question is, well, name these. So here's going to be the variable cost, fixed cost, and total cost. They'll take that legend out and say, well, name these lines. Well, you know that the fixed cost is going to be the same as basically the units go up, the fixed costs stay the same. You know that the variable costs start at 0, right? They're going to start at 0 and increase as we start making units. And total cost then should meet the vertical axis at the fixed cost point, and then go up in the same rate as the variable costs, as we see here. So this is just some examples of the graph. This is a very common graph. We should be able to basically kind of visualize this in a graphic format. If we put these out here just so we have them, it's going to line these up. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller so that we can say, all right, here's the total costs. Here's the fixed and the variable. So we could put these together and they're all basically made from the same data. Okay, and then let's take a look at some other type of activity we have. What if we didn't have data which was so perfect? We had some kind of mixed cost. We could see different types of graphs and how they might format. So for example, if we took this data and we insert the same graph, charts, we're going to insert a similar graph. We might want it more rigid this time. I'm going to use this one instead of a curve. We're going to use this item and it'll show us those this kind of relationship, this kind of step type relationship. And this will be a mixed cost typically. That's kind of a stepped mixed cost. And we'll talk about when that might happen, but you might see a relationship like this. And this is of course what we don't like to see as much because it's not a linear relationship, which means it's going to be more difficult to work with, although it is linear at certain points and it's fixed at certain points and variable at certain points. So we'll talk about how to deal with that, but notice how easy it is in Excel to just take these data sets and basically work with them. Here's one more just to give a different type of example. So insert charts, and we're going to make this a curvilinear. We could do this similar fashion, but this one probably better with a curve. And again, a non-linear relationship between this, and this is something we may see oftentimes within a cost relationship, and we have to then figure out what are we gonna do with that, because we would like to see a line. that's what we're hoping for. And if we don't see a line, we might want to approximate one in some way. So those are just some examples of the use of Excel to kind of visualize the basic types of relationships we can have. If you have a set of data and you want to put it into Excel and start experimenting with the graphs on it, highly recommend doing that, because it'll give you the visual picture, show the relationship of these items, and allow you to go through it and figure these items out. Also note